Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to continue the series on the Grünfeld Defense with the Petrosian System, also called the Taimanov Variation. But I think it's better to call it a system than a variation because there are multiple lines and it's basically a setup rather than a variation. Okay, so let's get into the opening. If you haven't seen the introduction to the Grünfeld Defense, I've made a video on the basics. Make sure to watch that before you continue. Okay, so d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5, the Grünfeld Defense. And now we are not going to be looking at the exchange variation anymore. We are going to start looking at the move knight f3. This is the three knights variation. And after the move bishop g7, this can still lead to multiple different lines. Queen b3 is the most popular move here, leading to the Russian variation. We are going to cover that in the next video. Today, we are going to focus on the move bishop g5. And the move bishop g5 is similar to the Brinkmann attack, to the idea of the Brinkmann attack. And it has the idea of moving the bishop outside of the pawn chain before closing it down or playing the move e4. It also tries to undermine the knight on f6, although it's not that common to take the knight, or it's not common at all. So the purpose isn't to take on f6. The purpose is to get the bishop to a very aggressive diagonal using the fact that black has already committed to fianchettoing his bishop. So any moves such as h6 followed by castling are going to be weakening the king further on. And in some variations, white can continue with queenside castling, trying to put a lot of pressure on black's kingside, as we are going to see. Now, black has several responses to this move. All of them are logical. The most common one is using the fact that the bishop can be used as a tempo gain. So the move knight e4 is the most common move, simply attacking the bishop. We are going to look at the sidelines first, but this is by far the most common move and the best move. After bishop g5, two other moves are possible. One of them is really passive, and I would advise against it. Now, this position after bishop g5 is equal according to the engines, so bishop g5 is not the most principled move for white. That is why black needs to play aggressively, he needs to play precisely, and he cannot play passive positions in which he wants to seek equality, because equality cannot be found here if you play passively. So one move that is common is c6, simply reinforcing the d5 pawn. But now white stands better. White sort of has an improved Slav position with black fianchettoing and the bishop already outside of the pawn chain. So white can simply continue with the move e3, closing down the position, defending his c4 pawn. And after black castles, white plays something like bishop d3. Black now uses the fact that the bishop has already developed and now takes on c4, dc4, bishop c4, h6, chasing the bishop away, bishop h4, knight bd7. This is very pleasant for white. This position is safe. White doesn't have any problems. He's going to castle on his next turn, and it's not that easy for black to break the Grünfeld center open. So ideas like c5 are still in play, but it's not that dangerous, and white sort of has an easy game here. That is why I would advise against the move c6 after bishop g5. c6 is a normal move, and c6 isn't a bad move per se, and you can play c6 if you don't know the theory, and I think that most commonly people continue with c6 if they don't know how to play against the Petrosian system. But I'm going to show you two options which are way more active and better. The first one is the most common sideline, and I don't think it's as good as the main line, therefore it's a sideline for a reason. And in the sideline, you simply use the fact that the c4 pawn is en prise, and you take the pawn. D takes c4. Now, this idea resembles a lot of positions from the Slav and the semi-Slav, the Botvinnik semi-Slav and the anti-Moscow and stuff like that, where black tries to win the pawn. The difference is that your bishop is a Grünfeld bishop, it's fianchettoed on g7, it's not coming to e7. So black has a lot more pressure along the diagonal. Now, white can continue in two ways. White can either play the move e3 or the move e4. I don't have to say that e4 is way more aggressive. The difference is that in Slav and semi-Slav positions, when e4 is played, black always has the option of playing the f8 bishop to b4, and reinforcing the pawn with b5. In this position, if b5 is played, then black is simply going to capture the pawn. It doesn't really work. The c6 pawn hadn't moved. Usually in the Slav and the semi-Slav, of course, the pawn is already on c6, so queen a5 check is an option which can be played. So in this case, if b5, knight b5, queen a5 check, knight c3, black would have the move bishop b4, double attacking the knight, with knight e4 ideas coming to mind. And it's going to be a theme in these openings as well, in these positions as well, and you have to mind the fact that black has the option of knight e4. Now, after the move e4, and we are going to look at e3 later, black continues in the most principled Grünfeld fashion, c5, and white doesn't really want to trade the pawn. White doesn't really want to take on c4 yet. White wants to reinforce his center, push it forward, and he plays d5. And now we have the Grünfeld pawn on d5, which is going to be really dangerous. It stops the development, the easy development of the light squared bishop from c8, and it puts a lot of pressure on the center. You can see visually immediately that the b8 knight doesn't really have that many good squares, and it doesn't have c6, doesn't have e5, so this pawn is a problem. Now, what black gets in compensation is trying to save his extra pawn. So in this position, black still has 8 pawns. You can see that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. White has 7 pawns, so black has taken on c4. And in order to save his pawn, and this might seem counterintuitive, but you need to know the theory to play it, black plays the move b5. Now, taking the pawn for white is impossible. If the knight takes the pawn now, when the c-pawn has moved, and that's sort of similar to what you have in the Slav defense, if the pawn is taken, black simply plays queen a5 check, trying to win the knight, and if the knight retreats back to c3, all of a sudden knight e4, and there is triple pressure on e4, and white basically loses the game. There is no way to save this position. It's going to be dead lost. Black is going to be a pawn up, and the white king is going to be stuck in the center. So after the move b5, the best way for white to continue is e5, chasing the knight away. And now, if the knight moves away, then knight takes is actually a possibility, because let's say black plays something passive. Let's say this happens. Knight takes, queen check, knight c3. You no longer have knight e4. You can no longer put pressure on the knight with the bishop, and this should now be winning for white. Therefore, after the move e5, black needs to continue playing aggressively. And this position is equal, but it's equal if you know the moves. It's equal if you know the theory. Now, retreating the knight is not an option, as I said, because the b5 pawn is going to hang. Therefore, black plays the very aggressive b4. Now, the c4 pawn is unpre, the f6 knight is unpre, and the c3 knight is unpre. And the best variation for white is ef6, and black continues with ef6, still double attacking 2 pieces, making bishop takes c4 impossible. But white is able to use the fact that the black king is still stuck in the center, and he can check with the queen. Of course, bishop e6 loses a piece. Queen e7 is not a good move. If black plays queen e7, well, okay, I'm going to turn on the engine for this one. If queen e7, queen takes e7, king takes e7, and yeah, once the bishop retreats, it's going to be less favorable for black, because if the bishop retreats and black takes here, I think white doesn't have to capture, losing the exchange, of course. Let me just check that. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, the pawn is still on f6. I'm sorry about that. I kept thinking that my bishop is open. Okay, so this doesn't work because white would simply have 6 pawns and a healthy pawn structure, a lead in development, and his king would be able to castle, and the c4 pawn is still dropping. So black is going to give up his extra pawn eventually, and white is going to be better. So after the move b4, we have e takes f6, e takes f6, queen e2 check, and the best move is king f8. You don't want to queen trade. After the move king f8, white now saves his bishop to e3, and now b takes c3, and b takes c3. Once again, the bishop is still behind the f6 pawn. And this should be equal or slightly better for black. It's aggressive, and it's very complicated, and it's highly likely that you are going to lose your c4 pawn and your c5 pawn, but you have a lot of pressure on this diagonal, and it could be fairly tricky for white to defend this. From this position, the most common move is knight d7, simply developing and defending c5. You can also play king g8, you can play bishop a6, trying to defend c4. And there are multiple options. f5 is not a good move here. I think that after f5, yeah, simply queen takes c4, defending c3, and white should be fine. Okay, so after the move d takes c4, the move e4 is very aggressive, and after e4, black needs to play energetically. c5, d5, b5, not possible to take that pawn, e5. And we have a very aggressive game where the black king is going to be stuck on f8, the white king is going to stay in the center for a while. So if you want to play the Petrosian system tactically with white, e4 is the move. If you want to play a slightly safer position, then e3 is the best option. After e3, you are putting pressure on the c4 pawn. Black continues with the move bishop e6. Defending the pawn now, of course, d5 is not possible because it's defended 3 times. If black wishes to give up his bishop, then d5 is still not possible because bishop takes, pawn takes, and queen takes. So this still doesn't work. Black would be 2 pawns up in this case. So after the move bishop e6, now we have a fairly complicated line, which is tactical. Okay, knight e5, putting extra pressure on the c4 pawn, trying to simply take the pawn. Knight d5, allowing white to capture but threatening to take on c3. And now we have knight c4, c5 trying to break open the center, white checks with queen a4 check, and knight c6. And this is, well, there's a lot of piece tension in the center, but it's likely going to end in a passive position which is very peaceful. Knight e5, double attacking c6, and now black has to castle. Knight takes c6, b takes c6, and now white doesn't take, because if white takes on c6, then I think simply c takes d is going to be sufficient and black is going to be better, putting pressure on c3. So bishop e2 trying to develop, and now c takes d, e takes d. You can take, but I don't think that should be the best option. I think c5 should be the best option, trying to open up the center, and c5 threatens to win an exchange. Let me just see what the engine says. The engines want... Oh, okay. I guess I have to give him a bit of time. Wait. Okay. Let's go back. Where did we go wrong? Okay, so e3, bishop e6. Knight e5, knight d5. Knight takes c4, c5. Now queen a4 check is a mistake apparently, and that's theoretically the most commonly played move. I'm wondering why it's a mistake. Knight c6, knight e5. Castles, knight takes c6, b takes c6, and now bishop to e2 is a bad move. Okay, let's find an alternative for queen a4. Instead of queen a4 then, knight b5 has only been played 9 times. Knight e4 has been played 9 times, and rook c1 has also been played. Let's go with knight b5. And after castles, e4 now. Yeah, this does seem better, but black should still be much better here. So what's wrong? Okay, e3, bishop e6. Knight e5 is theory. Knight d5 is mainline theory. Knight takes c4 is the main move. c5 is the main move. Is it possible that black is so much better here? I would like your advice on this, because I have been studying this variation from a theoretical perspective, and I'm not sure why this should be so much better. Apparently black has managed to break through the center. So let's go over that once again. I'm sorry this is going to take a bit longer now, so we have to figure out what white is doing wrong and its theory. Knight e5. It's probably the fact that my PC is really slow, so using the engine doesn't work unless I let it work for a long time. I'm going to try once again. Okay, knight e5 is a mistake, but it's the main move. If bishop e2 and castles, and castles, white should be slightly better. So perhaps bishop e2 is the way, but why are all the grandmasters playing knight e5 if it's bad? Knight d5, knight c4, c5. I'm really confused about this. Okay, the highest winning percentage for white came after the move knight b5. Castles. And now white seems to be doing fine with the move e4. And this, oh, this is why the engine doesn't like the variation, because cd is possible. And what if pawn takes knight? Ah, okay, queen a5 check. And two knights are hanging. Okay, this is really complicated. Okay, e4. Let's see. This is the theoretical move, knight f6. And now all of a sudden, white is much better. Okay, excuse my slow PC and my bad engine. I'm going to try to figure that out. Okay, so e3, bishop e6, knight e5, knight d5, knight c4, c5 is correct. And now knight b5. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Knight b5 should be played. And after castles, e4. Now the problem is that black has this very tricky c takes d4. And after c takes d4, if white takes the knight, then queen takes knight. The bishop is hanging, the b5 knight is hanging. Okay. So after c takes d4, white shouldn't take the knight, white should take the pawn. And now after bishop takes, queen takes, the knight has to move now. Okay, no, a tempo on the queen first. The queen moves back and knight b4. Well, the material here is equal. Both sides have 6 pawns. White has the bishop pair, but black has managed to break through the center. So I don't see why black should be better at all. He has given up his Grünfeld bishop. But okay, white is still 2 moves away from castling. Yeah, okay, this position is complicated. Be careful with pawn to e3 as white. I guess that's the reason why e4 is more popular. So let's go over that once again. Bishop g7, bishop g5, the Petrosian system. If black plays dc4, play e4. e3 is complicated and, according to my engine, should be better for black, or at least too tricky for white. If you play perfectly with white, then you might be fine, but still play e4. So once again, after dc, play e4. Black should play c5, d5, b5, e5. This is the variation that you want to play. And in these lines, white should be slightly better. And this is why I don't like the move dc. Because after d takes c4, this position, even though black is a pawn up, seems much easier to play for white. White has this huge center and these two very aggressive central pawns. Okay, now let's look at the main move, knight e4. Knight e4 tries to chase the bishop away. Now, white can react in 3 different ways. Well, 2 different ways, but one way is 2 moves. White can either ignore that and give up the bishop with c takes d5, which is the main move, or he can retreat the bishop. The bishop can go either to f4 or to h4. h4 is a more popular move, and now knight takes c3, b takes c3, d takes c4, and black can now regain the pawn with queen a4, queen d7, queen takes c4, and you can see that both sides have 7 pawns, so the material is equal. Black is going to be faster to castle, and I think I would rather have black here, because white has an isolated pawn on a2, white has hanging pawns, or still not hanging pawns, on d4 and c3. If he plays e3 and solidifies the structure, they're going to be more defended. And black has this option of playing knight c6, knight a5 to knight c4, trying to gain control over the c4 square, which is one of the main weaknesses in the Grünfeld. Now black should continue with the move b6, and the point of the move b6 is not bishop b7, the point is bishop a6, and you're going to force the white king to recapture on f1, or the rook, because If white doesn't continue with e3 solidifying his pawn chain is going to be weaker. If he plays g3 and e3, then he's going to have a lot of dark squared weaknesses, and also g3 runs into h6, g5, trapping the dark squared bishop. So white has to play the move e3. If he tries moving the queen, then still bishop a6 stops e3. So once e3 is played, bishop takes, king takes. After b6, e3 is the main move, bishop a6, queen moves to b3, takes, king takes, castles. And now white has this huge center. It's not going to be easy to break it open, but he is unable to castle, and he is yet to develop his rook. So white should continue with the move king e2, trying to get his rook into the game, c5, trying to break open the center, and now rook h to d1, cd4, cd4, knight c6, rook ac1, knight a5, gaining a tempo on the queen. And here, according to the engines, this should be equal, according to theory as well. You can see that this pawn structure is thematic for the Grünfeld. White has the e pawn and the d pawn. They are not on e4 and d5, but they could be. And black has a 2-to-1 pawn majority on the queen side, which can be utilized easily, much easier than white's pawn majority. So trading pieces should favor black here, in my opinion. Any piece trades will make it much easier to push these pawns through, and the black king is closer to stopping white's pawn majority. So that's the move bishop h4. Instead of bishop h4 after knight e4, white could also play the move bishop f4, which should be slightly better. I think the bishop is better on this diagonal than on this diagonal. And also, perhaps g3 is an option, because now the bishop can retreat back, but still it shouldn't be a good option. So now knight takes c3 once again, b takes c3, c5. Black plays the same things he was playing before against bishop h4, bishop e3, trying to develop his f1 bishop, castles, cd5, queen d5, bishop e2 trying to castle, and now cd4, cd4, knight c6. Once again, we have the same pawn structure. The difference is that the bishop is on f4 and not on h4. Perhaps in some positions this has allowed the black queen to move, because otherwise the e7 pawn would have been hanging. And I think this is once again equal, both according to the engines and according to theory, and you have the same plans with black. You want to push your queenside pawn majority, trade off the pieces, if possible put pressure on the a2 pawn. Okay, and the main move after knight e4 is giving the bishop up, giving up the bishop pair with c takes d5. Now, after c takes d5, black has to follow up a with b. It doesn't make any sense to play knight e4 and then not take the bishop. So knight takes g5, knight takes g5, and now the only move in this position, which gives black a slight advantage, and this is why I think that Petrosian system shouldn't really be played by white. I think this is easier to play for black, especially because you have this great bishop which now has no opposition. So white has basically traded off the counterpart of the Grünfeld bishop. So in theory, this should be hard to play for white. Although it's hard, black still has to prove that. So now e6, not of course taking on e6 is not possible. E d6, fe6, or bishop e6, knight e6, fe6 is not possible, because the knight is hanging. So white needs to either retreat the knight or defend the knight. Retreating the knight is slightly less common. Something like e d5, e3 castles happens. And in these positions, the pawn structure is going to resemble a queen's gambit declined, with one of the main plans for white being the minority attack. If he wants to play positionally, if he wants to play aggressively, then he can go for queenside castling. But if, let's say, the pawn structure is with c6, which is probably going to happen, let's say bishop e2, c6, then white could go for a3, b4, b5, trying to weaken the c6 square and get his knight from a4 into c5, so for the minority attack. And after e6, the main move is queen d2, defending the knight instead of retreating it. And now we have the move e d5 once again. Queen e3 check is the difference, because now that's a more favorable move. King f8. Once again, trading queens would allow knight takes pawn, and then c7 would be weak, and you would have to play king d8. So king f8 is the only move here. Now queen f4. threatening to checkmate on f7, bishop f6, attacking the knight and saving black from checkmate, and now h4. And this is the most aggressive and the best way for white to play, putting kingside pressure on the black position. You can still go for a positional game with e3, bishop e2 castles. Black is going to play c6, you can play a3, b4. But if you play h4 and these variations with queen e3, queen f4, now you are basically committed to an attack. h6, chasing the knight away, knight f3, and now king to g7, opening up his rook. And here white castles. And this is what the Petrosian system is about. In my opinion, if white plays the Petrosian system, then he probably wants to play this. This is very aggressive, and it's not likely that the game is going to end in a draw, even on grandmaster level. This is very aggressive, and there are going to be a lot of chances for both sides. From this position, about 50 games have been played. White scores a bit worse than black. Black wins a slightly bigger percentage of the games, and that's because black's king, despite the pawn avalanche, is slightly safer. Bishop e6, e3, trying to open up his bishop, knight d7, bishop d3, c6, solidifying his d5 pawn, and now g4. And you can see that white is going for an attack. There's no other way to put that. White wants to checkmate. And if black plays carefully, in theory he should be slightly better. If he misplays the position, white is going to checkmate. So queen b8 is the best move, I would advise, because the black queen wants to trade itself, black has the bishop pair, black has a safer pawn structure, and black hasn't committed himself with a couple of pawn moves towards the white king yet. So trading of the queens would benefit black here. Rook d to g1, taking here would allow an extra pawn to come towards the center. It would be too dangerous. So now we play bishop e7, and now white is forced to trade the queens off. If bishop d6, then black loses the queen. So now queen takes b8, rook a takes b8, knight e2 or something else, and white is still going to try to attack, but of course the attack is not going to be as potent because the queens are off the board, and black can now look forward to his own pawn pushes, something like b5 or b6, c5, trying to gain more space on the queen side. White is going to play on the king side, black is going to play on the queen side. Checkmate is not as likely because the queens are no longer on the board, and I would give a slight edge to black. He has the bishop pair. Even though the position is closed and the light squared bishop on e6 is not that good, white only has the light squared bishop, so he doesn't have so many squares to roam around on because all of black's pawns are on light squares. So this bishop is going to be what makes the difference in the position, in my opinion. Okay, sorry once again about the e3 lines after dc4. I got a bit confused and my engine got a bit confused. I would advise that to dc4 players with white played the move e4. It's more aggressive and better. And for black, I would advise you to fight the Petrosian system with the main line, knight e4. And whatever black plays, if he goes for cd4, black should be better. You just need to learn the attacking patterns white has on the queen side. And bishop h4 and bishop f4 are slightly inferior to cd4 in my opinion. Okay, let me know what you think. I hope you liked the Petrosian system. I know it's a lot of theory and that it's complicated. I hope that you managed to learn something. If you would like extra material, I'm going to post 5 tasks on the Patreon feed and an in-depth look in the video. So if you want to reinforce your knowledge and solve some practical exercises, head over to Patreon. You can find the link in the description below. Thanks very much for watching and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.